Hello everyone, today we are going to be reading chapter 7 in Lucky Strike. So let's get into it. Monday morning found Nate fixing his own breakfast and telling himself to hurry up or he'd miss the bus. "Sorry, boy," his grandpa had said the night before as he packed his cooler for the next day. "I got so many fishing trips lined up this week. I have to be out the door before sunup every blessed day." Grandpa bustled around the little trailer, smiling in a way Nate hadn't seen in a long time. "Don't you know why my luck's changed? But I got to get while the gettings is good. Got to ride this wave right into red snapper season," he said, pretending to ride the surfboard of his youth. Nate popped 2 slices of bread in the toaster. He watched the appliance with an eagle eye while he stirred powdered cocoa into his milk. Yes, the toaster had been reliable lately, but he reckoned that wouldn't last. Ding! Both pieces of toast sailed into the air and landed neatly side by side on the paper towel. The toast was truly wondrous in its perfection. "Geez Louise," Nate breathed. "Did you see that, Grandpa?" He turned to the couch grinning, but of course, his grandpa had been gone for hours. "I'm telling you, Jen," Nate said as the school bus bumped along the sandy road. "It was like the toaster had it all planned out. I wouldn't have been surprised if it had buttered itself and opened the jelly jar." Jen looked up from her book on theoretical physics and sighed. "Nathaniel, a toaster cannot have a plan because a toaster does not have a brain." She shook her head and poked her nose back into the book. She had just started the chapter on chaos theory and found it, well, disturbing. "I know that. I'm just telling you what I saw, is all. They landed right next to each other, neat as you please. What do you think the odds are of that?" He poked her in the ribs with his elbow. Not looking up from her book, Jen said, "It's just like flipping a coin. If you do it enough times, the odds are in your favor. If the toast flies out of the toaster, as you claim, enough times, odds are they will land side by side one of those times." Nate slumped in his seat and picked at the stuffing oozing from the tear in the vinyl. "It's not the same at all," he mumbled. "I knew that coin was going to land on heads. I felt it for a fact." The bus pulled into the entrance of Liza P. Woods Elementary. The familiar dread Nate always felt when he got to school lodged in his stomach like cold leftover grits. Jen gathered her book and pushed her glasses up on her nose. She watched the chaos of running, screaming, laughing, crying kids and sighed. She reached up to pluck at an eyebrow, and then popped a rubber band on her wrist instead. Mrs. Beam's latest attempt to preserve Jen's eyebrows. Nate pulled the sleeve down on his bandaged hand and arm. Jen blinked up at him. "Okay, it's your first day back. Are you ready?" "I guess," he said and followed his friend off the bus. He knew he'd feel a whole lot better about things if he could still wear his favorite pair of red tennis shoes, but at least he had his lucky rabbit's foot. See you back here after school," she said, like she always did, something that gave him comfort. A spitball sailed through the air and landed in her hair. Nate plucked it out. He watched as she walked down the long corridor through the gauntlet of kids who laughed at and taunted her. Her backpack full of books hung almost to the backs of her knees. She was the only kid in school who had iron creases in her jeans, and the face of Albert Einstein in her backpack. For one single second, Nate wanted to run to catch up with her, to glare and holler at the kids who made her life at Liza P. Woods miserable. It wasn't any use trying to protect Jen, though. They were the same kids who made fun of his miserable life, too. The difference, Jen always said, was he cared what those kids thought, and she did not. Easy for her to say, he thought as he turned and headed to the other end of the building where his classroom waited for him. She had the whole big, messy, noisy love of the Beam family behind her. Nate pulled open the door to room 311. The cold lump of dread shimmied in his stomach. He haunched his shoulders, rubbed his thumb over the lucky rabbit's foot, and braced for the snickers and eye-rolling and the feet that would try to trip him up as he walked to his desk. Instead, tumult silence. Tiffany Hedges and Chantel Peaks's eyes widened instead of rolling up into their heads. They studied him with wonder. Buddy Hayes poked Connor Marlar and whispered, "Look, it's Sparky," which Nate supposed was a better nickname than Loser or Shorty McFarty. He dropped his eyes to the floor, hurried over to his desk on the far side of the room, and slid into his seat. He wasn't exactly sure which was worse, the familiar taunting and tripping, or this silence, the way they looked at him like he was an alien. He was relieved when Chum Bailey, the only person in Nate's class who the kids teased more mercilessly than him, ambled into the room, his head newly shaved from his recent battle with head lice. Chum had been christened Charles Rumbert Bailey by his proud parents and Father Donovan at St. Mary's Catholic Church. The kids at Liza P. Woods Elementary christened him Chum because of his uncanny ability to attract those who preyed upon the weak. Someone laughed and called out, "Look who's back, Chum the Bum!" Pencils, rubber bands, and wads of paper bombarded the big boy. The feeding frenzy began as Chum made his way over to the desk beside Nate. Nate scrunched down in his desk to avoid the fallout. Chum dropped his book bag on the floor as a rubber band launched paperclip whizzed past his ear. "Welcome back, Nate," he said. "I'm glad you're okay." Nate scrunched further down in his seat. Without looking at Chum, he said, "Thanks," out of the side of his mouth. "I waved at you at the fish fry, but I guess you didn't see me," Chum said. He had indeed seen Chum wave. "There were lots of people there," he explained. "There sure were," Chum said, just as a shriveled, half-eaten apple bounced off the side of his head and landed in his lap. "You sure are lucky," Chum said, "being so popular and all." Just as Nate started to explain that he hardly knew any of the people at the fish fry, Mr. Peck stalked into the room. His long, knobby legs, clad in tight black pants, ended 2 inches above a pair of white shoes. A dozen long strands of dark hair crested the top of his head. He reminded Nate of the great blue heron that hung out at the docks. Mr. Peck glared at the mess strewn across the floor. He marched to his desk at the front of the room and banged his briefcase down hard. He put his hands on his hips and surveyed the classroom with a withering stare. Even the meanest, boldest kids straightened up and flew right. "Good morning, my hooligans," the teacher said. "Good morning, Mr. Peck," everyone mumbled. "Good morning, teacher," Chum sang out, warm as a puppy. "I'm back." "I see that," Mr. Peck said. "The bugs are all gone from my hair now," Chum said proudly. Tiffany snorted with laughter. Chantel made a retching sound. Mr. Peck shot them a look as sharp as a knife. "Thank you for that information, Charles." Then his pale eyes rested on Nate. "And welcome back to you, Mr. Harlow. I'm glad you escaped the slings and arrows of nature, as it were." "Thank you," Nate said. "You're most welcome," the teacher said. He removed his plaid jacket and rolled up his shirt sleeves. "Only 37 days left of school, my rapscallions. Let's see what I can teach you before your brains turn to mush during summer vacation." Nate could hardly wait to tell Jen about his day. Even though they were both in 5th grade, they rarely saw each other during the day, not even at lunch. Jen was in every gifted and accelerated class the school could think of. There had even been talk of advancing Jen 2 or maybe 3 grades, but her parents said no. "Brains don't necessarily equal good sense," Mrs. Bean had said. "Jen needs to take her time." Nate knew this was true. He also knew Jen had been sorely and deeply disappointed. He waved from the back of the bus when Jen appeared at the front. Her shirt tail hung half in, half out of her rumpled jeans. Her glasses hung crooked on her nose. Nate had a feeling she had not had a good day. Jen plopped down on the seat beside him and hugged her backpack to her belly. She absently stroked her face of Albert Einstein over and over. "You okay, Jen?" Jen reached up and plucked at an eyebrow. "Fine." "You don't look so fine," Nate pointed out. She shrugged. "Just a difference of opinion with another student, that's all." Nate frowned. She had twice been sent home from school this year because of these differences of opinion. Before he could bring this up, Jen said, "How about you? How was your first day back?" "Oh, Jen," Nate said, "it was such a weird day." "Weird how?" "Nothing bad happened." He told her about how lucky he was that Mr. Peck hadn't called him for the reading that he had done while he was home. I kept thinking, with my luck, he'll call on me for everything. But he didn't. Not once. Jen shrugged. Probably just felt sorry for you, wanted to give you time to catch up, even though I did bring your schoolwork home for you, and even though I did offer to tutor you. Nate ignored her. And then at lunch, Mrs. Walker thought she'd given out the last creamy, but then she just happened to find one that had fallen on the floor, so she gave me that one. Jen rolled her eyes. Yeah, that's lucky. Yeah, and just when I thought I'd have to sit with Chum Bailey in the cafeteria, Rico Sanchez and his cousin said I could sit at their table. He didn't mention they'd only wanted to see the burns on his hand. And then in PE it rained, so we got to stay inside and watch a movie on oral hygiene, which to Nate's way of thinking was much better than not getting chosen for sides, or better than hearing Coach Hull say, "Good Lord, Harlow, you don't have the sense God gave a goose." Nate leaned his head back and smiled. Yes, it had been a lucky day indeed. Jen rubbed at a smear of something red on her shirt sleeve. Yeah, well, add to your lucky list not being a preacher's kid. And then she pitched her low and perfect imitation of the Reverend. Genesis Magnolia Beam, what kind of an example are you setting for your younger brothers and sisters, brawling and fighting? The good Lord and the rest of the world would expect better from you. Jen took off her glasses and inspected the flap of tape holding them together. I'll be writing out passages from the Bible from here to eternity. Later that evening, just as Nate was thinking he'd walk down to the docks to look for his grandpa, he heard Alfred rattle up the Oyster Show road. Sorry I'm late, boy, Grandpa called as he jumped from the truck. You wouldn't believe the day I had. He caught Nate up in a bear hug and mussed his mousy hair. The fish, they just kept a-comin'. My clients would reel one in, we'd rebait and hook, and then get a strike not 2 minutes after casting the line. I've never seen anything like it. Those two fellas, they were both from Knoxville. Were so happy with their day, they gave me a $50 tip. Grandpa reached into his fish gut spattered coveralls, pulled out a $50 bill and snapped it. $50 cash, Nate. Can you believe it? No, sir, Nate said. I hardly can't. Grandpa ran his hand through his wild hair as if trying to tame his mind. Good Lord, Nate. Supper. Have you eaten supper? I fried up a piece of bologna, he said, and I was just about to open a can of tomato soup. His grandpa clapped his hands together. I'm so hungry. I could eat a whale. Let's go over to June's and get those cheeseburgers I promised you for your birthday. Ice cream, too. How does that sound? Nate thought it sounded like a perfect ending to a nearly perfect day. Can Jen come? Sure can, Grandpa said. Heck, we'll take the twins, too. He stood in front of Nate and smiled. But before all that, I have a surprise for you. Nate frowned. He'd never been big on surprises. Life, at least his young life, had too often been scarred by the unexpected. Close your eyes, his grandpa instructed, and don't look until I tell you. Nate closed his eyes and waited. He heard Grandpa walk away, then something clang against the truck. Okay, you can open your eyes. He opened his eyes and gasped. There before him, the most beautiful bicycle in the world gleamed in the fading spring light. Grandpa walked the bike over to Nate. Happy birthday, son. Nate ran his good hand admiring over the gleaming handlebars and sheer gear shifter. It's amazing, he whispered. It looks brand new. Grandpa nodded. It is. I got it over at Pedal Pushers in Apalachico. Nate pulled his hand back. But Grandpa, we don't have the money for a brand new bike. I've had it on layaway for months, he said. I was going to give it to you on your birthday after we had all the cheeseburgers at June's, but, well, then the lightning struck and his voice trailed off. Nate looked at the bike again. He took the rubber grips on the handlebars, the reflectors on the spokes, and the leather seat, just waiting for its rider. Grandpa gave him a little push. Why don't you ride it on over to Beams while I get cleaned up? I'll pick you up over there. Nate fairly leapt onto the bike. If he didn't know better, he'd swear it was about to rear up like a spirited horse. He rolled like the wind over to the church of the one true Redeemer and everlasting light. skidding to a halt in front of Joshua and Levi with a flourish. "Look at that!" Joshua said, leaping to his feet. Levi ran his little hands across the handlebars. "Where'd you get it, Nate?" "Grandpa," he said. "He just gave it to me for my birthday." Now he wouldn't have to ride the old hand-me-down bike with the girl seat he'd been using for years. "I can't believe I got a brand new bike," he said. "That means you got your birthday wish, right, Nate?" Joshua said. He frowned. "What do you mean? 'Member? I told you to wish for a bicycle for your birthday." Nate shook his head. In truth, he couldn't remember what all happened in the hours before the lightning strike, but wishing for a brand new bike sounded like as good a wish as any, and if he had, well, that could mean his luck had changed. Couldn't it? Alright, that's it for chapter 7. We'll read chapter 8 next time. See you then!